that's been going on. And then also, what does it mean to be a professional writer? So basically, I've figured out that
This is Duke University.
Salamishah Tillet's new book, Sites of Slavery, examines slavery in the post-civil rights imagination. Suhail Daulatzai's new book, Black Star, Crescent Moon, examines black radicalism in the Muslim imagination. My name is Mark Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real live G for this one. Yeah.
Good afternoon and welcome back to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by University of Pennsylvania Professor Salamishah Tillet, who's Assistant Professor of English and Africana Studies and author of the new book, Sites of Slavery, Citizenship and Racial Democracy in the Post-Civil Rights Imagination. That's at Duke University Press. She is also a contributor to The Nation and TheRoot.com and the co-founder of A Long Walk Home, a nonprofit organization that uses art therapy and the visual and performing arts to end violence against girls and women. How are you doing today, Salamishah?
I'm doing well. You know, it's a big day for the country, so.
Yes, it is. That's good. And before we get started, so you have one new baby, Sites of Slavery, but you also have a second new baby. Congratulations on the birth of your daughter, Seneca. What's it like trying to balance new motherhood with new authorship at the same time?
Oh my God. Well, I'm happy to be on your show because it means the book's not getting the complete shaft. But it's interesting. Yeah, I always heard that one's relationship to writing changes when they have children. And you can probably attest to this, obviously, better than I can. But it's been interesting just to think about, what it means to be a mom, what it means to be a mom in this kind of new decade, with all the kind of political strife that's been going on. And then also, what does it mean to be a professional writer? So basically, I've figured out that after she goes to sleep is when I can get my writing done, which I guess you've all known all along, but it's really challenging. But so far, so good. She's only 5 months, so I'm sure it'll get even more challenging as she gets older, but more exciting as well, I think.
I saw some wonderful photos of Seneca with you when you were doing a book signing at the University of Pennsylvania bookstore. And I always remember, and this is before my two daughters were born, with a photo of Robin Kelly. And it must have been a book signing maybe for Race Rebels or the book after that, and he was there with his daughter. And I just thought how cool that was, right? to be able to bring, a young child to your book signing, right? It just, so again, congratulations to you.
Thank you. And what's missing in the photo, and I have to give my sister a shout out, is Seneca was wearing a onesie that says, "I know the author." So she was quite a hit. People actually came to the book signing to see Seneca. They told me that before I even began talking about my book. So apparently she's good for sales as well.
So let's talk about this book, Sites of Slavery. And I love this language that you use to kind of describe the African-American fascination, if you will, with returning to these quote-unquote sites of slavery, particularly in the post-civil rights era. This term civic estrangement.
Yeah.
This kind of interesting balance in between citizenship and political rights. Yes, African-American have political rights, but is it true citizenship? And you come up with this term civic estrangement. Talk a little bit about that.
Thanks for even, pulling that out from the book, because it was my kind of unique intervention, I think, in African American studies and in American political culture. And also just, I shout you out as well in the introduction. So your work has obviously been really important for me as a scholar and as an activist. So civic estrangement is a term that I came up with based on how political scientists and political theorists think about citizenship, and particularly Roger Smith's book, Civic Ideals. And so one of the things that he says in his book is that citizenship is not simply the right to vote or the right to earn, but there are other forms of citizenship that are kind of more capacious, more evasive, and harder to define. And those are the kind of civic notions or civic characteristics of citizenship, right? So the feeling that you belong to the nation, the understanding that your history is represented in the founding myths of a nation, for example. So African Americans who have been in this country since its inception, but have had a really complicated relationship to the nation's founding, right? Like we can't claim democracy without recognizing that we were the kind of victims of the democratic experiment in the United States. Our ancestors were enslaved. So for me, civic estrangement is the feeling of both, you're legal citizens of the United States, the post-civil rights phenomenon, you're legally belonging to the United States, and so you have certain rights and certain privileges, and at the same time you feel like you're kind of outside of the nation, that your history and your path has been written out of how the nation sees itself, and so that you're still a stranger in your native land. And so it's a play on other, theorists and artists like Du Bois and Wright, obviously, but it's a new sense of belonging and non-belonging that I think is unique to the post-civil rights era.
Another term that you use in this way of talking about what you might define as a democratic aesthetic and what you call a critical patriotism, right? That this kind of need to be in, but at the same time to be very critical of what you are in at the same time. Talk a little bit about how some of the artists that you examine in the book kind of do this kind of version of critical patriotism.
Yeah, so I don't believe, and then from the artists that I look at and the writers that I look at, I don't believe that this attachment to the United States or this desire to achieve the democratic ideals of the United States is without criticism, right? That it's not, or without a kind of critical language or critical idea of what the United States has been and continues to be. And so I think that, if you look at these representations of slavery by contemporary African-American artists like Kara Walker or Carrie Mae Weems or Bill T. Jones, Ishmael Reed, Annette Gordon Reed, they're varied. If you look at these representations of slavery and what I argue are really kind of clarion calls for American democracy, that these representations are about a kind of critical engagement with the United States, about a testament and an attestation of the ultimate ideals of the United States that have been unrecognized and have been unmaterialized. But that to be a patriot is really to be someone who is engaged with the process of democracy, at the same time with a deep understanding of the dyad between American slavery and American freedom. So, for example, my first chapter looks at Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, and I look at novelist Barbara Chase Rabaud's Sally Hemings. I look at historian Annette Gordon Reed's 2 books on Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson controversy, and I look at a play by Robbie Macaulay called Sally's Rape. And all of these representations, even though they're very different from each other, kind of posit someone like Sally Hemings as the true custodian or true guardian of American democracy, as opposed to someone like Thomas Jefferson. And so you would think of Sally Hemings then as a critical patriot, right? Someone who was in their imagination or their imaginings of Sally Hemings as someone who fought against slavery, even though we have no real historical record of this fact, as someone who fought against slavery and therefore was preserving American democracy in the face of Jefferson as the author of the Declaration of Independence and as a founding father of the United States.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Salamishah Tillet. He's the author of the new book, Sites of Slavery, Citizenship and Racial Democracy in the Post-Civil Rights Imagination, just published by Duke University Press. I want to start here with the Sally Hemings chapter, which you start the book off with, which in some way it makes a lot of sense given the kind of work that you've done with A Long Walk Home. And so you look at all these kind of folks who've done treatment of Hemings, and what you talk about wanting to tease out is this kind of notion of Hemings as a radical black female subject. Yeah. Talk a little bit about, the work around Sally Hemings in that way. I mean, because from so many folks, if they even know about Hemings, it's as Thomas Jefferson's concubine. Yeah. Or maybe they saw, Nick Nolte in an awful casting choice in Jefferson in Paris or something like that. And immediately you think about Tandy Newton. Oh, yeah, that's right. That's the imagery that comes to mind. But talk a little bit about this figure who you argue in the book, talking about the artists who write about her, is really this kind of critical figure in the beginning of American democracy. who we don't even know what her voice sounded like. You know, talk about how she functions in this concept of sites of slavery.
Yeah, you know, well, Sally Hemings, again, like you said, we don't know what her voice sounds like. We have very few records of her existence in terms of like the historical, capital H historical record. There's ledgers of her name is in ledgers of Jefferson from his farm and then also from Paris. Her son, her youngest son, gave an oral history in the mid early 1860s, and that's basically all we have of her. So everything that we understand about Sally Hemings through these African American women writers like Barbara Tracy Bonnet, Gordon Reed, and Robert McCauley is really based on some historical documentation, but really their imagination. And so I find it really compelling that in each of their works they really describe her as someone who was committed to ending slavery, for example, or in the miniseries, the CBS miniseries that an African American playwright and screenwriter Tina Andrews did. She presents Sally Hemings as someone who's quoting Thomas Paine, who is actually teaching enslaved African Americans how to read and write.
Cosmopolitan, right? She's a cosmopolitan subject, yeah.
With Jefferson about the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, the representation of Sally Hemings is pretty radical. So what I was interested in is, well, if this is how people want to imagine Sally Hemings, if this is how people are kind of reincarnating her in the post-civil rights period, what's the investment in that on one hand? And two, what kind of conversations are they putting Sally Hemings in place? Who are they putting Sally Hemings in place with, right? So they're clearly putting her in conversation with other Black feminist authors and other Black feminist historians. So this Sally Hemings that emerges in their work is really, really cosmopolitan, as you said, an aesthete, and also someone who is really committed to ending slavery for her children in particular, but also for the nation at large. And so it's really interesting. And I argue that basically Sally Hemings becomes the kind of conduit or a metonym for African American identity in relationship to the nation, right? So that she's our way to claim not only Jefferson's legacy, but actually to claim the United States as our country, for better or for worse.
So you start the book off with Sally Hemings, and you know, already it's a book that's framed around returning to slavery, if you will. And you can imagine readers are wondering, you know, well, you know, how deeply are we going to have to really engage this? But then you make an interesting turn and you go to the arena of satire, right? And of course, Glenda Carpio's work is really large in this regard, her book, Laughing Fit to Kill. But you look at some, you know, how some satirists have looked at slavery in very interesting kind of ways. Ishmael Reed's Flight to Canada, which, you know, personally is actually maybe my favorite book of his, and one of the first of his novels that I read, but also looking at the work of other figures like Kara Walker. So talk a little bit about those two in particular, engaging Reed on Uncle Tom's Cabin and Harriet Beecher Stowe, and then, you know, looking at Kara Walker's treatment of it, you know, 2 decades later.
Yeah, you know, I think I wanted to bookend that chapter with the kind of early interventionist Ishmael Reed's Flight to Canada, as you pointed out, from the 1970s. And his response really to the kind of pressures that Black nationalism put on African Americans, right? And so what he does and that chapter is about African Americans, contemporary African Americans engaging this controversial novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? So for the most part, you think Uncle Tom's Cabin, you think of Uncle Tom as someone who's like a traitor. Like that's been the kind of discourse of Uncle Tom, really arriving in the early 1920s in African American culture, but as a result of the minstrel representations of Uncle Tom. So when someone like Ishmael Reed reclaims Uncle Tom through the character Robin, I found it not only fascinating, but why would one do that at that particular moment in time? And so he really is trying to resurrect a civil rights legacy that he felt like was being trivialized and compromised in the Black Power era. Then you speed up to someone like Kara Walker, who's writing producing art at a very different moment in time, has a different set of politics and a different set of concerns. And she's really not interested in reclaiming Tom, I argue, but she is fascinated with Topsy. And if you think about her work and her oeuvre, the ways in which the Black female subject / object becomes both like a site of slavery, obviously, but also someone that we have to reckon with, I think is really fascinating. So I wanted to give a kind of a sense of how both, these figures, Tom and Topsy, are engaged with in the post-civil rights era, but also show how writers and artists are revising each other. And within I also put Bill T. Jones's wonderful 3-hour piece, The Last Supper at Uncle Tom's Cabin / Promised Land, and Robert Alexander's Ain't Your Uncle New Jack revisionist of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So satire, I think, is really important, and Glenda's book is really phenomenal in that. But I also felt like I wanted to think about the ways in which African Americans can use satire to re-engage democracy. And it's a very different kind of project, let's say, than the first chapter, which is all about history and interiority and subjectivity in this way. I'm arguing that these artists are exploding the representations of putting it out there, and they're asking us to have new attachments to the nation as a result.
I want to talk about Topsy for a second, because in the context of Kara Walker's installation, Topsy is really staging, or Walker is really staging a slavery revenge narrative, within the context of that. Yeah. And I think that's kind of interesting with, the Django Unchained, coming out in a couple of months. Talk about that narrative, at least, not only in terms of Kara Walker's work, but where you might have seen this narrative kind of show up in other moments of African American expression, kind of leading up to Django Unchained. I mean, I'm thinking about it in that way because I've been having an ongoing argument with someone on Twitter about how phenomenal it is for Tarantino to come up with this narrative. And I was like, no, well, this narrative has always existed in very different forms in African American art. There have been very few black directors that would have been able to have a project greenlit that dealt with it, but it doesn't mean that it's not happening in our literature in terms of our playwrights and in other places.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the 19th century. So I don't think, like, you're right to point that Quentin Tarantino has the privilege and the luxury of being able to produce a film at this moment in time. But that the revenge narrative, which ultimately is a kind of rebellion narrative, something that is, part of the African-American literary and cultural tradition, and was part of many of the abolitionist works, black abolitionist works to end slavery. So to think of Tarantino as unique, as opposed to a beneficiary of centuries of experimentation and artistic and political work by African Americans is a bit premature. But I think what's interesting about Walker, and this brings us back to both Reed and also someone like Robert Alexander, is that those are actually revenge narratives too. Flight to Canada ends with the character Robin outwitting his slave master and doctoring the will. His slave master is dyslexic, so the character Robin was always the one who was doing the bookkeeping and the writing. So at the end of the novel, this character Robin not only has doctored the will in his favor, but then has created a kind of a literary colony for former slaves to come back and write themselves and write themselves out of slavery on one hand and write about slavery. So their revenge narratives, again, are part of the African American tradition. But I think what's different about Kara Walker's piece, one, is the way in which she uses gender, right, to think of sort of black women as the insurrectionist, which is different than what we're going to see in Django Unchained, I'm almost certain. But also, I think that Kara Walker's piece gives us a sense of discomfort because in Reed's case or in Alexander's case, there's a sense that democracy can be attained through certain forms or certain rituals of commemoration and communion. But I think Kara Walker's work really kind of pushes back against thinking about democracy as something that's always achieved through comfort or through agreement. I think she forces us to think about revenge as a really logical outcome of the racial melodrama, and also to think about revenge and also rage as a way of engaging the nation on new terms. So it's uncomfortable. And then I think that's why I ultimately end, and you can talk about this with reparations, because I think the reparations may be even a middle ground between sort of pure conciliatory gestures and revenge itself.
You're watching Left of Black. We're here with Salamishah Tillet, author of the new book, Sites of Slavery, which looks at citizenship and racial democracy in the post-civil rights imagination. Duke University Press, a longtime contributor to The Nation and TheRoot.com. Assistant Professor of English and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. You cite the work of my colleague Bio Hoseley in the book, particularly her book, Roots of Remembrance.
Yes.
And this way that Black artists have gone back to literally, the initial sites of containment, if you will. Mentioning the work of Chester Huggins, you mentioned earlier Carrie Mae Weems, and of course the filmmaker Halle Jarima, in particular his film Sankofa. And I'm wondering how you would say compare those kind of narratives to say another kind of narrative of Black transnationalism, if you will, listening to Jay-Z and Kanye talk about niggas in Paris. Is there a common ground in some ways in these narratives? Are we looking at contemporary Black celebrities in some ways trying to reconnect in some ways with a transnational Blackness, that might not be available to them in Chicago or Brooklyn?
That's a complicated question. Well, I would say that it is, I think the desire to create these transnational communities comes out of being from Chicago or Brooklyn, or in the case of Carrie Mae Weems, she began her journey in the South and looking at sites of slavery in Louisiana and the Sea Islands, and she said that she didn't really find remnants of slavery there. While she found the kind of ghosts or the traces of slavery, she had to leave the United States and go to Africa to see official sites of slavery. Right. And so I think that what I was interested in that chapter, and I'll come back to Jay-Z and Kanye, but what I was interested in that chapter is this kind of post-civil rights, the advent of a post-civil rights African-American tourist, which that's what Jay-Z and Kanye are, and that's what Carrie Mae Weems and Chester Higgins are. And arguably in Sankofa, that is what the character Shola knew it. Right. And so that's a real unique, you have African-American cosmopolitans, you have African-American travelers throughout the late 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, with the kind of mass exodus or the mass travel into West Africa to visit these sites of slavery is really
a recent phenomenon. Yeah,
a class who has the ability to do that and the desire to do that. And I also was interested in the fact that these tourism narratives are in lieu of back to Africa travel narratives about finding a new homeland or about establishing a kind of deeper commitment and a familial attachment to West Africa like you would see in the 1960s or you would see in the 1860s. So I was really fascinated by the emergence of tourism, the advent of the Black middle class, and then the way in which slavery becomes a new way of connecting to Africa, but it's also a temporary way of connecting. It's not kind of a long-term engagement, which I find troubling, but at the same time I think is really kind of fascinating and I guess result of being part of the American citizenry on one hand, but also feeling like you're still not fully American on the other hand. Jay-Z and Kanye, I think, you point to, that's really interesting if you think about them as part of a longer history of Blacks in Paris that starts with Sally Hemings, for example, that really kind of changes over time in the 20th century in particular, from someone like Baldwin to more recent representations like Kanye and Jay-Z. They still are both kind of invoking an African American exceptionalism is what I would argue.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's disconnected, oddly enough, from the kind of other niggers in Paris that are living and breathing and working without being recognized fully by the French state. So.
You've been watching Left of Black. We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Salamishah Tillet, author of the brand new book, Sites of Slavery, Citizenship and Racial Democracy. In the Post-Civil Rights Imagination, Duke University Press, just published. She is a contributor to The Nation and TheRoot.com and the co-founder with her sister, Scheherazade, of A Long Walk Home Incorporated. Thanks for joining us, Salamishah.
Thank you.
Hugs and kisses to Seneca to us.
Oh, thank you, thank you. And, hopefully today's a good day all around.
Okay. Take care.
You got to hold it down for us.
Yes.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye. Good afternoon and welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by Professor Sohail Daulatzai, who is the author of the new book, Black Star, Crescent Moon, The Muslim International and Black Freedom Beyond America. That's University of Minnesota Press. How are you doing today, Suhail?
I'm good, Mark. I appreciate you having me on Left of Black. It's an honor for sure, my man.
Let's kind of jump in it real quickly. We just saw the re-election of President Barack Obama in the midst of lots of issues that are going on in Egypt. Of course, Syria has been popping off for the last year or so.
Right.
Take us back to 2008 for a moment and talk a little bit about what the election of Barack Obama might have meant for the Muslim world in 2008 and what that looks like now in 2012.
No, I mean, that kind of cuts to the kind of core of the book. I mean, in many ways, what I wanted to try and do with the book, and, I opened the book in the introduction with the inauguration, the day of the inauguration of Obama, that happened actually in '09. But the book really was kind of not only a prehistory to kind of 9/11, in the sense of kind of framing the presence of Islam and Muslims in the United States, but through the lens of blackness, but also a prehistory to kind of like what's being referred to as the Arab Spring today, and looking at what was the history of black radicalism and black Islam to the Muslim third world, the anti-colonial struggles that were going on, this pre-Arab Spring, so to speak, in the 50s and 60s. And so the book is really trying to kind of trace out that landscape. And in doing so, I think the Obama election in '08, and fast forward even to today, I think many of those issues obviously are still relevant as we're talking about a post 9/11 moment. And in particular, I think one of the things that I tried to kind of probe in the introduction was, what in particular did Obama's election mean for not just the legacy of Black internationalism that had been established and fought for and struggled for so deeply, but for its present moment as well, in terms of like how might we think about how not just Black political culture, and of course we're talking there's a range of Black political cultures, but what does it mean to have a politics domesticated, and what does it mean to think about politics internationally? I think Obama, in his immediate, one of the first things he meant to do was he had that big famous speech in Cairo, the entitled "A New Beginning," to the so-called Muslim world, and in the speech he tried to kind of refresh, so to speak, the U.S. posture toward toward the Muslim world, and I think it was an attempt to try and rebrand kind of, in fact, the image of the United States post kind of Bush Cheney. And I think that, we've seen that through different registers throughout Obama since 2008. But I think in many ways, it's interesting how the rhetoric here about, what's been referred to as the Arab Spring is seen to kind of coalesce with the election of Obama, that from '08 on, there's been this kind of change, this hopefulness that has kind of overtaken the world in particular, and that in the Arab world, so to speak, this thing called the Arab Spring has erupted, and in some ways it's been tied to this kind of shift that Obama kind of brought in globally. And I think it's interesting to find out. I mean, obviously, it's very difficult to talk about that Arab Spring, so to speak, as a monolithic thing. They're all very different, Tunisia, et cetera. But I think it's really important, and we're seeing that today, especially with the struggles over Morsi and the Brotherhood in Egypt, that that was very much the beginning stages of a kind of transformation in the region, and that what we're seeing, particularly in Egypt, is something that reveals how enduring these forces really are, and quite honestly, the enduring presence of the United States in that region, that in many ways it hasn't really been as much of a transformation as maybe people would have liked or had hoped for, and that in a sense the real struggle for sovereignty and dignity that is taking place is really beginning now.
I mean, it's interesting because on the one hand, I mean, part of what you're arguing for here is that there's this powerful symbolism in Obama that we've seen in many myriad ways, even here in the United States, that in some ways, he doesn't have a hands-on impact on, right? But it just creates this perception, this kind of break with Bush Cheney, that there are these other possibilities. At the same time, much of the Obama administration's foreign policy has in very real ways been an extension of Bush Cheney. And so, how does the Arab world, for instance, the Muslim world, for instance, come to terms with the symbolic representation of Barack Obama and the reality of drone strikes, in African nations, in Pakistan, et cetera.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, it's something that obviously, I was born in Peshawar, which is right on the Afghan-Pakistan border. And my family's living under those drones in many ways. And so while this is a principled political issue, it is also in a particular way deeply personal. And there was a lot of that going on around the time of the election about how people's, deeply personal connection to the, Obama versus Romney informed their decision to vote for Obama over Romney and not say, for example, a third party candidate or whatever. And so I understand the importance of that, but I think that you're absolutely right, Mark, that, Obama's policies in many ways have been almost more muscular and more militaristic than Bush Cheney in terms of expanding the U.S. military footprint in the region. And I think that's something that in some ways hasn't really gotten lost per se. I mean, I think people are aware of it, but I think there's a kind of limitation in terms of like a political imagination that could be forged is in terms of like, what do we do about that? What does it mean that Obama's military posture has been more aggressive? What does it mean that America's footprint in the region has actually expanded under Obama? And what might we be able to do about that? And I think that that's part of what I was trying to do in the book was to try and kind of provide maybe a historical lens for the different ways in which Black artists and activists sought to imagine that. And I think, it's a complex question because obviously we're dealing with kind of like the centrality of the nation state in terms of like the limitations that it can afford. But I think the first step is to understand like, what does it mean to have a Black president as the face of empire? And, in many ways, as I've talked to many of my friends and, we have these debates and many of us fall on there's not just two sides to this, but on multiple sides of this. What does it mean to have a Black president as the face of empire? And what, as some of my friends have argued, Obama's presidency in many ways is going to reveal the limitations that, as I've kind of often said, power doesn't lie with the king, it lies in the throne. Yeah. And so maybe Jay and Kanye had something when they said, watch the throne. But I think that the throne is a very kind of operative metaphor for thinking about how we understand power to operate.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
You're watching Left to Black, and we're joined this afternoon by Professor Sohail Daulatzai, Associate Professor of Film and Media Studies at the University of California at Irvine, the author of the new book, Black Star, Crescent Moon, The Muslim International and Black Freedom Beyond America, that's University of Minnesota Press. One of the things that your book really talks about is this kind of international trafficking in Black radical thought, particularly in the 1950s and the 1960s. Talk a little bit about the circuits and the roots, if you will, of this kind of exchange between what's happening in the Arab world, the Muslim world in the 50s and 60s, and this emergence of Black radical thought, particularly in the form of a figure like Malcolm X during that period of time, the kind of rich exchanges that are taking place, in both the United States and the Arab world.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you hit it right on. I mean, obviously kind of Black internationalist impulses, the idea of linking kind of not only the struggles of Black peoples here in the United States with those of the third world was about really understanding the global nature of not only white supremacy, but also kind of racial capitalism. And I think this is something that has been enduring within Black internationalist thought throughout the 19th and 20th century. And it really picks up steam, obviously, after World War II, which is really where my book kind of, springs off of. And as you're right, Malcolm X becomes this kind of like powerful figure. And he kind of, he's this recurrent figure throughout the book in all 5 chapters in different ways. I wrote a piece in Al Jazeera recently called Respect the Architect, which really looks at kind of the presence and power of Malcolm as a figure within kind of Black internationalist thought. And he was this key figure because, it was Malcolm who kind of really at this really fertile moment and volatile moment where, the third world was kind of seeking to break the bonds of colonialism that were imposed upon it for centuries in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So their struggles against white supremacy kind of converged and dovetailed in very powerful ways with struggles over desegregation, the rise of Black radicalism, and more militant wings of the Black freedom movement. And those convergences kind of created this opportunity where Malcolm and others, Robert Williams, Revolutionary Action Movement, the Panthers later on, really sought to imagine Black peoples in the United States not as national minorities, but as part of a global majority. And so this took place in a whole host of different ways. I mean, there's the first Pan-African Congress in Algiers that takes place in 1971. But even before that, Malcolm, I closed the book by talking about Malcolm's trip. He made a couple trips to Egypt, but in particular one in 1964, where he talks to the Organization of African States in terms of trying to internationalize the struggles of Black peoples and taking it to the United Nations. And so there were these actual kind of like real politics type moves that Malcolm and others sought to make. But my book is also about looking at it through the lens of kind of art and, the role that film and novels, and obviously later on in the 80s and 90s, hip hop culture came to play in terms of like imagining Black freedom beyond the boundaries of America. So, for example, I talk about the influence of the film The Battle of Algiers on not only like Black radical praxis here in the United States, not the Black Panther Party, talked about that film as kind of required viewing for the party. But also it's the film's importance in terms of like the Algerian struggle, Frantz Fanon's importance, and also how it informed Black cultural politics. The debate between Lerone Bennett and Huey P. Newton over Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, Battle of Algiers becomes this kind of symbolic signpost for thinking about how Black radical politics could take place. And then, of course, I talk about it in terms of the influence on Sam Greenlee, who was the novelist who wrote The Spook Who Sat by the Door, and later on Baghdad Blues. And his experience in Iraq in the late 50s is what really kind of gave him the inspiration to write The Spook Who Sat by the Door. So this trafficking was taking place both in the realms of kind of formal politics, but also in the realms of kind of like art and culture as well.
Let's talk about the art piece for a moment. One of the unique things about hip hop in the late 80s and early 1990s, and an aspect of hip hop that's largely been erased, was the influence of Muslims, whether we're talking about traditional Islam or in the form of the 5% Nation on hip hop. I imagine there are young folks now who might be introduced to groups like Poor Righteous Teachers and Eric B. and Rakim and Brand Nubian and would think that this was something from another planet. Because we don't hear any of those resonances in contemporary hip hop, in 2012. Talk a little bit about the Islamic influence on hip hop in the 80s and the 90s, and why you think it's a resonance that literally disappears, as hip hop grows up and matures, if you will.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot going on there. It's a great question, Mark. I mean, I framed that chapter on hip hop. I call it Return of the Mecca, but I frame it around kind of this immediate post-civil rights moment, like right by the early 70s, the United States, through kind of the law and order discourse, the Black criminal emerges as this figure, quote unquote, and simultaneously, so does this figure of the Muslim terrorist,
right?
Quote unquote, right? So we have this kind of these kind of twin pillars of U.S. statecraft defining American national identity from the 70s on. And it's really interesting that, again, by the mid to late 80s, all of a sudden you see this explosion within the realm of popular culture, where, as you mentioned, Brand Nubian, Poor Righteous Teachers, Public Enemy, Lakim Shabazz, Gangstar, Pete Rock, CL Smooth. We can just go on in terms of what is defined as the golden age of hip hop. Was overwhelmingly artists who identified in one form or another with Islam,
right,
or being Muslim. And it really defined this golden age in a particular way. It was not only about a particular kind of political consciousness that informed it, but it was also about a certain style and aesthetics as well. And so you saw this convergence in the late 80s, early 90s, and I think that had to do, obviously, with Reagan-Bush policies, the repression in the post-civil rights era, where, all of a sudden Malcolm, Spike Lee's film, all of a sudden, captures this in 92, but Malcolm, the discourses on Afrocentricity, and Islam become these lenses through which young Black folk are starting to imagine themselves in dignified ways again, historically within other traditions of Black political thought, but also in the contemporary moment to what's going on beyond the boundaries of the United States. And so this was like a very fertile period within hip hop culture. And, I just did my final lecture in my hip hop culture class that ended about a week and a half ago on this influence, and students were shocked. I mean, obviously, we can point to kind of contemporary examples of this. For example, Yasin Bey, aka Mos Def. We can point to Lupe Fiasco. We can talk about certain artists like Freeway or Beanie Siegel who are still around, still doing records at a certain level. But while those are kind of traces of this previous moment, it's really hard, as you mentioned, for young people to really understand how
deeply embedded,
this was within kind of hip hop culture. And I think that has to do with a lot. I mean, I think I traced that in the last couple chapters in the book. There was a kind of, I think, concerted effort to kind of crush the influence of, or silence the influence of, Black Islam within the United States, particularly in the 90s and obviously after 9/11, because of the particular critique it made about U.S. society. And so I think, that had a lot to do with the silences, as well as, hip hop culture itself transforming into this, kind of commercial leviathan that, kind of left, less space for those kinds of ideas to emerge,
An interesting figure from that period, someone like Minister Louis Farrakhan, and whatever his motivations might have been at the time, I mean, he was really the only kind of mainstream Black leader that saw anything politically of value in hip hop, right? And closed ranks around it very quickly, whether it was, coming to the support of groups like Public Enemy, who of course would sample his voice in various records, the way that he would mediate discussions, like when tensions were high between Common and Ice Cube. And it's like funny, that's one of those moments, again, you say to young folks, what, Common and Ice Cube had beef, right? But it's Louis Farrakhan who comes in, right, who mediates. And I think there was that interesting moment in the midst of the stuff with 50 Cent and Ja Rule, and Farrakhan tries to mediate that, and it doesn't work anymore. And you recognize that something has shifted in the culture, right?
Absolutely. And Farrakhan, I mean, you're right. He was, I mean, it's kind of this, it's interesting. Like, I need to maybe, crush the numbers, so to speak. But like, who's the most sampled voice in hip hop? Is it Malcolm or is it Farrakhan?
God, right.
I think it's a close, it's neck and neck between those two. But obviously Farrakhan had a kind of really central place within not just hip hop culture, and Black youth culture at a particular moment, but Black political culture. And you still see, I mean, I'm watching things online with him going into Chicago and, going into New York and, around the stop and frisk stuff. And he's still this kind of galvanizing figure. He's gotten older, but he still kind of has this kind of tempered respect within amongst a larger segment of kind of Black political culture that I think, speaks to this enduring influence and this kind of, I think, this impulse about speaking truth to power in a particular way for all of Farrakhan's maybe flaws. You know what I mean?
I mean that's the irony, right? I mean, for those of us who are quote unquote on the Black left, who have real critiques of a kind of Nation of Islam style politics, right? There is this recognition, of the force of an integrity about him and the Nation of Islam, at least at this moment in time, that still resonates. We're talking this afternoon with Professor Sohail Daulatzai, who is Associate Professor of Film and Media Studies at the University of California at Irvine, the author of the new book, Black Star, Crescent Moon, The Muslim International and Black Freedom Beyond America, University of Minnesota Press. What's up with you next, Sohail?
Well, I'm working on a couple of different projects, actually. I'm working on a book on the Battle of Algiers. The 50th anniversary of the film is coming out, so I'm kind of working on a project that kind of takes the film and the different issues around it, whether it be torture, occupation, resistance, quote-unquote terrorism, and trying to take those debates, a little bit deeper. And I'm also working on a book, kind of more personal, about AFPAC and that border region and my own history in terms of what that was about. So those are kind of the two books that are kind of on the stove right now, and a graphic novel that is kind of bubbling that, I'm also going to work on. So, the plate is full at this point.
Thanks for joining us this afternoon, Suhail.
I appreciate it, Mark. As always, keep up the good work, my man.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah. All black everything, all black you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes, all black everything, all black polos, all black medallions, yeah, all black you know, say, all black everything, all black you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes.
This is Duke University.
Salamishah Tillet's new book, Sites of Slavery, examines slavery in the post-civil rights imagination. Suhail Daulatzai's new book, Black Star